Yeah.
All right, good evening, everybody. It's part two of Seneca versus Schopenhauer. Um, we did Schopenhauer a couple of weeks ago now, so I've mostly forgotten what Schopenhauer had to say. Luckily, Johnny here's listened to it today, so
Fresh.
he'll be up with it. But I just remember that Schopenhauer's views were pretty bleak. He thought, I think, in the towards the end of that short essay, he was making sort of comparisons with penal colonies, and that was kind of the way he saw being in the world. Whereas in Providence, we've got a very different view. So just jumping straight into part one, it's very short, the first part. Do you want me to just give my very quick notes on one and someone else can do two, something like that? Cool. Okay, so he starts out with the question of why so many evils befall good men. He sort of takes it for granted that his interlocutor, it seems like he's talking to someone throughout this. Do you know who he is talking to, Judith, or is it just to a
Oh, well,
general
it's
audience?
to Lasanius, the same person that he addresses the letters to Lasanius.
Oh, of course it is. It says right at the beginning. You have asked me, Lasanius. Yes, thank you very much. So, and obviously, Lasanius accepts that there's some sort of guardian that keeps the cosmos going. They don't have to have a debate about that. He says, obviously, things aren't moving at random. He kind of gives this good, really well-told description, really, of the apparent miracle of the natural order. It's really good. Everything has causes. There's obviously something behind the scenes that makes nature and the world kind of work the way it works, rather than just fall apart. Or anyway, so they just have this kind of matter-of-fact kind of acceptance that obviously because of that natural order, providence must be there. So we're not really doubting providence or arguing about whether providence is a thing or not, but rather he says to Lasanius, you're really just complaining about providence. You're complaining that providence hasn't given you good things all the time. He says, but however, our argument will really be about that the good cannot be injured by the good. So there's actually no evil in the world, it would seem. At least an evil that comes from God or providence. And there's a relationship of likeness. So the good man is quite similar to nature or God. So he says between good men and the gods there is a friendship, which is brought about by virtue. Friendship, do I say? Nay, rather relationship and likeness, since the good man differs from God in time alone, being his pupil and rival and true offspring, whom his glorious parent trains more severely than other men, insisting sternly on virtuous conduct, just as strict fathers do. So therefore, and I mean, that's interesting. We could say a lot more about that, but I think it's really interesting, the Stoic conception that this idea of the relationship and likeness between man and the cosmos, that's something that you can't really gloss over. It's obviously a really important feature. But something that really came out through this text that was always behind the scenes was sort of this idea of fate. It's already here at the beginning that everything has causes and the causes go right back. But it kind of indicates that there's a distinction between the virtuous man who's aware of his relationship, his likeness and the relationship to God, but that it's kind of fated, it sort of seems. So he's very privileged to be in that situation in the first place, because even if you were a tyrant, you had lots of money and power, you're still nowhere near as well off. In fact, you're really in a really negative situation in terms of what God could have dished out to you. The wise man, or the man who's at least aware of his likeness, is very, very fortunate to be in that situation. That's kind of the setup. Would you kind of agree with that setup?
Yeah, I think something about this, reading it again,
especially where people sort of attribute this as being a response to the problem of evil. There is like a way, like there is some sense where it does sort of fall under the problem of evil, but it's not like, it's a very weak form of the problem of evil. So it's almost like it's responding to something like related, but just that little bit different, because it is like, as he says at the start, why, if the world is governed by providence, is it still the case that good men suffer from many misfortunes? Like, it's a very narrow thing. Like, it's not looking at misfortune or suffering of everyone and anyone. It's just very much around the people who are virtuous, and like that's what he's addressing. And not to say like this is a invalid question or anything like that, but I do just wonder, as a more broad point, about how this this essay is described in modern times as a response to the problem of evil. I think it's sort of, it kind of just, it's not complete. It's not. I wouldn't be too strong to say it's wrong, but it just sort of doesn't quite summarize it in like what it's actually addressing, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Shannon. Thank you for that. And it hadn't quite struck me in those terms, but you're right. I think, though, I'm really struck by the fact that Seneca kind of just gets straight into this issue. And you're right, it's a narrow version of the problem of evil, but it's the particularly salient one, I guess, for us, I suppose, there's two salient kind of cases, and one is the suffering of the innocents, like young children, right? That's the one that gets us, but the other one is the good person. So that's the one he's focusing on, and I suppose culturally we can think about why that might be, why he focuses on that rather than the other one. And obviously in ancient Rome, there's very high infant mortality. That was part of it. And the diseases of infancy and childhood were, let's just not say poorly understood, they weren't understood at all. So I would say that would explain why they're not at all concerned really about the illness and suffering of young children, which is salient to us, but rather are concerned about the illness and suffering and death and torture and so on of the person who has been virtuous in their life. So maybe that's why he's focusing on that. But against that background, as I say, I'm just struck by the fact that he meets it head on. You know, that's what he's going to be addressing. He doesn't beat around the bush. Lycidas has obviously asked a question. And as everyone must eventually, sooner or later, ask the question, why is it that terrible things happen to good people? So, and I think it's this first section is such a tour de force, which links the Stoic conception of nature, the cosmos, the way that things are administered, things are set up, things continue to function. You know, it's not just the way things were set up in the first place, it's the way things continue to function that Seneca's drawing our attention to. And he specifically says, even things which appear to be confused and irregular. I mean, showers of rain and clouds, you know, those unpredictable, those things that don't happen when we would want them to happen. You know, we don't get rain when there's a drought. We wonder why the hell that's happening. But even those things, even those irregular occurrences are all part of a bigger cycle. It's just that we can't see the you know, the graph, as it were, of the ups and the downs of it. So he's very explicit about that. And yeah, I just think it's a real tour de force of explaining the Stoic view of the cosmos, and finishing up with this idea around the relationship between the human and the divine. And as you drew attention to, Courtney, he explicitly says, since the good man differs from a god in time alone, you know, in mortality or immortality, being his pupil and rival, that's an interesting expression, and true offspring, whom his glorious parent trains more severely than other men, insisting sternly on virtuous conduct, just as strict fathers do, or as we might say, you know, as a top-ranked coach does. You know, a top-ranked coach doesn't coddle his his athletes or his players, he pushes them as hard as he believes that they can go, and a bit further. That's what he's doing in order to bring out the best in them. And so that's the kind of the background here. It's very dramatic, it's very comprehensive, and I think really impressive as an opening.
And I might add, because of just reading this alongside our Nussbaum, Therapy of Desire, throughout the Ira, she's saying, she's sort of remarking how Seneca is careful how he takes up the argument. So he doesn't do anything that's going to startle the reader too much at the beginning. You know, he's sort of using he's kind of nurturing the common opinion a little bit, you know, and he's not really saying anything radical here either. He's saying, yeah, well, you know, look, everything's regular, everything's ordered, of course, you know, of course there's some sort of force behind the scenes which keeps things going. Everyone agrees with that. So rather, you know, to answer, you know, maybe Shannon, maybe rather than go after some contentious issue right out of the gate, he's careful to kind of get the reader on his side and say very general things that most people could agree with. He's not talking about infant mortality, for example, which would be a much more kind of delicate issue. Yeah. So yeah, I wonder if that's in the background too.
I didn't mean it as like a critique of Seneca. Like, I think he's very clearly laid out, this is what I'm responding to. This is the question, and he's addressing it like Courtney and Judy, like you've been saying. He does a good job there. I just more mean in the way it's presented in modern times. I feel like just referring to this as a response to the problem of evil, it's kind of right, but it doesn't really capture like what he's addressing. Like, it's a very narrow thing, and I think he does do a good job responding and presenting the Stoic position on that. But yeah, it's just something that I feel like it feels like the way this is this essay is always presented is just as, it's just the problem of evil. But it's like it really is just why bad things happen to good people, but related. And you probably like there's probably like a perfectly reasonable argument that it does fall under that, but there's like I feel like the problem, if someone came in to read this as, this is going to address the problem of evil, I think they would leave dissatisfied. But if they came in with like, this is addressing why bad things happen to good people, I think they would be satisfied by this.
So if Nussbaum's right about, you know, her analysis of the Ira, she is saying it's a therapy. So what he wants to do is appear to be doing an argument, maybe at the beginning, like what you're asking for, an argument on, you know, what's going on with evil. But actually what he wants to do is offer a therapy to Lucilius. So in order to do that, he can't start off too strong because he will put his defenses up. So he has to kind of get his allegiance, have him on side. And if he is actually doing something like that, she says in the Ira, for example, he leaves the Stoic doctrine like around externals and that, and extirpation of the passion. He draws on those only right at the end, once he's got the interlocutor on his side, and they have internalized the kind of critique, you know. And so we might find the same sort of thing here. We might find that in this pseudo argument, if you like, but rather, you know, piece of therapy, we might find the same sort of introduction of externals, not at the beginning, but towards the end and stuff like that, which I think is what happens.
It sounds like from the bit I was reading, he's trying to more justify tribulation or evil as a necessary function of creating the better man. You know, the through fire, the purpose. What does he say? If tribulation is the divine principle, then it has a like outcome. Purpose of discipline is to better the whole self or being. Therefore, bad things happen to good men because it betters their beings, hardens them, builds virtue in their souls. And as far as the soundness of this reasoning is concerned, I see no flaw. Simply observing the world, we can see that excellence is achieved by discipline, and hardiness is only made by experience, which force one to harden. So I guess he's he's not trying to explain the origins of evil, is he? Or give a purpose for it in a bigger context. He's just trying to frame it in a way that is helpful, I guess. Yeah, that's what is that what he does with the whole thing? Does he go later on and try and get into why it would be that way, or does he not bother with that?
No, I think you're right. I think it's what's called a theodicy. So it's a that means a kind of an account of divine justice, really. So yeah, I think he's just trying to give an account of the world as it is found and those processes, divine and human, that we find. He's trying to give an account of that is acceptable, I suppose, rather than confronting or paradoxical. So he's trying to present the events as they occur in such a way that the listener or the person, the silenced in this case, can appreciate the reasoning, if you like, or the ratio in the Latin. I say, the structure, the framework, and I suppose it doesn't necessarily mean that the listener or the person is going to accept the ratio, the framework, the structure, but Seneca's taking it on himself to present it and present it in its best light, I guess, and most convincing
best light. Yeah, that's a good way.
I'm happy to tackle section 2. So again, he repeats this key question right at the start: why do things turn out badly for good men? But then we take it around the other way, and that's what you alluded to earlier, Courtney. And this is what we found in the Gorgias. We find it in the Apology. We find it in Socrates' account of it, or Socrates' life in general. This idea that nothing bad can happen to the good man. Nothing. So the man who is virtuous, who does his best, nothing really bad is going to happen to him if we perceive things correctly. And so it's not going to affect his mind.
Very Marcus
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Although this is 150 or 100 years prior to Marcus, and so and it's a beautiful image. So many showers of rain from the clouds, such a number of medicinal springs. The Romans loved their medicinal springs. Do not alter the taste of the sea. Indeed, do not so much as soften it. So the pressure of adversity does not affect the mind of a brave man. For the mind of a brave man maintains its balance and throws its own complexion over all that takes place, because it is more powerful than any external circumstances. So this is the idea of the Stoic sage, the sophos in Greek, the sapiens in Latin, the wise man who is steadfast and has what the Romans call constantia, consistency in everything he does. And that's because he's not fazed by anything that occurs. And again, then Seneca goes on to give this image of the athletes, this athletic training image, which was so powerful for both the Greeks and the Romans, because that was such a big part of their culture. It was athletics and gladiatorial combat, physical striving against each other. And so that's why it was such a powerful image. Of course, St. Paul also used that image when he wanted to appeal to Greek audiences. When it suited him, St. Paul could talk that language as well. But also he refers back to the family. And there's actually something in this, how fathers are more pushing their kids to push themselves further in different athletic or other endeavors, and mothers are more tolerant, perhaps more risk averse as to how they treat their kids. But then we get another argument here about the fact that the converse is not good either. So unbroken prosperity is not conducive to a happy life. And this was so, kind of salient again for Seneca, because obviously he was working and living in the court, and Nero, the person he was working for at different times, was someone who was that person whose household, it was their job to make sure that he had no difficulties to meet with. But obviously that is not a good situation in terms of somebody's character. And the contrast is when he says, we are sometimes delighted when a youth of steady courage receives on his spear the wild beast that attacks him, or when he meets the charge of a lion without flinching. And the more eminent the man is who attracts this, the more attractive is the sight. Yet these are not matters which can attract the attention of the gods, but are mere pastimes and diversions of human frivolity. So again, he's drawing this idea of someone, and we see a young athlete and we are engaged in their challenges. We see a young athlete who's working towards a goal, and it's inspiring because we see the difficulties that they face. But rather, he says, for the gods, what do the gods like witnessing? What kind of athletic contest do the gods like? Well, they like to see a worthy man facing challenges. And so here we find this great role model for the Stoics, Cato, who was from a previous generation. He was a contemporary of Caesar and Cicero, and he lost his life. He took his own life in the Civil War, and this was another key Stoic idea, that if things have got to such a pass that a good life cannot be lived, for instance, if there's an authoritarian ruler, or a completely unvirtuous situation, if there is no way to act virtuously in that situation and it's just hopeless, then as Epictetus says, the door is always open. There's always that option of a dignified suicide, and that's what Cato did. And Seneca says he doesn't shy away from the details. While he drove the sword into his sacred breast, while he tore forth his vitals and laid his hand upon that most holy life, which was unworthy to be defiled by steel. This, I'm inclined to think, was the reason that his wound was not well aimed and mortal. The gods were not satisfied with seeing Cato die once. His courage was kept in action and recalled to the stage that it might display itself in a more difficult part, for it needs a greater mind to return a second time to death. So notoriously, Cato had to stab himself several times in order to achieve death. And Seneca concludes this section: how could they fail to view their pupil with interest when leaving his life by such a noble and memorable departure? Men are raised to the level of the gods by a death which is admired even by those who fear them. And so this is another key feature for ancient philosophical schools. Until a man or a woman had met their death, it's impossible to classify them as virtuous, ultimately. It all depends on how they meet their death, whether it's in battle or illness, or in the case of certain key figures, by suicide. So that's, it's confronting for us because we don't like to think about those end-of-life questions, and it's very confronting to think about people making those decisions about their end of life. And it's particularly confronting when it's someone, say, in our own family or in our own circle. It's very confronting, but that's what Seneca is urging us to think about in our assessment of what is the best for humans and what the gods ultimately like to see.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, I one bit in here, I might be stretching it a little bit, but I'm always really keen on these observations around tonos and this idea of hardening up oneself, and this sort of strengthening the substance of what we're made from. And where he says here, those who are surfeited with ease break down not only with labor but with mere motion and by their own weight. I feel like it kind of gets to that idea that we're not merely doing something intellectual, but also something very physical with ourselves, toning up the muscles of our own moral character, creating a greater sense of a greater reality of substance, if you like. Yeah, but that's probably stretching it a bit there.
I don't think so. I think that's spot on, Courtney. I think absolutely that physical aspect is always to the fore in Seneca's accounts.
And another thing I was wondering, and I think again I might be stretching it, but I'm interested in this idea here. He says, about the young man who spears the lion, for example. Do you wonder that God, who so loves the good, who would have them attain the highest goodness and preeminence, should appoint fortune to be their adversary? I should not be surprised if the gods sometimes experience a wish to behold great men struggling with some misfortune. And then how we tend to do that, we will see, like he says, a youth with steady courage receive the wild beast on his spear. That fills us with delight. So wouldn't the gods feel a certain delight when they see a great man struggle with his burdens? I was wondering to what degree he was saying, obviously he's drawing on the common opinion. We all like to see these spectacles, but also maybe there's a deeper intuition that there's a preconception there that we thrill when we see these physical displays against adversity, because there's a part of us that is able to see how there's actually a goodness in that. You know what I mean? So, but then again, I don't know. Maybe I'm stretching it. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that that's why, the Greeks, for example, that's why we have the Olympic Games. It's because that that agon, that struggle, that is key. And it's also in the literary tradition. It goes back to the Iliad. It's around great men, and in some cases women, competing and struggling. It's that competition and that excellence, and that's partly where virtue arises. That's obviously arete means excellence as well as virtue. It means doing better. It means going further. It means exceeding the norms. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think when we see a great athletic performance, we're seeing a kind of virtue, a kind of excellence that we can all recognize. Even people who don't think about virtue can recognize it. And that's why sport is so popular and so powerful. We see people breaking records, doing things that nobody thought they could do. And that's partly what Seneca's gesturing to here.
Yeah, and the way he presents it kind of fits with Nussbaum's observation that the Stoic thinks that they can present their theory, their therapy, in a manner that even a non-Stoic will agree with. So he's tuning into the things that we just know to be the case. So that's really interesting. So shall we get to part 3 then? Did you take any notes, Johnny or Shannon, or shall I do that?
No, I didn't. I was just going to say on that, I did notice in one part, I think it was in that last bit near the end when you were talking, he acknowledged, I don't know if it was Schopenhauer or maybe, but there was a reference to not everyone has this capacity. Some people are, I don't know what the words is, sluggish, did he say? Some people just can't, they haven't got it in them to be the best person they're ever going to be because they're sluggish or they're pusillanimous or you know what I mean? Just he did have a little sort of comment on maybe genetic makeup of different people means these aren't concepts or ideals that are accessible to everyone simply because of their, personality traits. Maybe we'd say if we did their big 5 personality reckon run, some people just aren't going to be able to reach their best potential because they haven't got those skills in them, which is a little bit sad, I guess.
I think that was the point I was trying to make early on, is that it almost seems fated that certain people will become better than other people. He calls them sluggish and dull and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, those were the words, weren't they? Yeah.
Oh, and that other point, Judith, I wanted to make too was, oh God, got a terrible memory these days. I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, we'll jump ahead to 3. Okay, so basically that he introduces how his argument should proceed, that evils are not so, but hang on, he says, I shall prove that what appear to be evils are not so. For the present I say this, that what you call hard measure, misfortunes, and things against which we ought to pray are really to the advantage, firstly of those to whom they happen, and secondly of all mankind, for whom the gods care for more than for individuals. And next, that these evils befall them with their own goodwill, and that men deserve to endure misfortunes if they are unwilling to receive them. So he makes some pretty bold claims right there. And that actually gave me a really interesting idea, because he's really seeding little therapeutic ideas here. And you could in the therapy room get somebody and say, can you write down 2 or 3 of the greatest misfortunes of your life? Make sure they're not fresh, because we've discussed freshness in this bound, they should be not fresh. But let's unpack them, and you might find that they've been very formative and they've actually helped you develop a stronger character as a result. So there's actually a kind of exercise hidden in his words there, a technique. So again, we see here that he says, to this I shall add that misfortunes proceed thus by destiny. And that was the point I was making just before. And that they befall good men by the same law which makes them good. See, that's interesting, isn't it? After this I shall prevail upon you never to pity any good man, for though he may be called unhappy, he cannot be so. I think there's a lot in there we could probably talk about just for a minute. Do you have any first impressions, Judith?
Yeah, no, as you say, there's a lot there, Courtney. And so he seems to be shifting here from suggesting that the gods actually enjoy seeing people overcome hardships and challenges. He then he's making a kind of an argumentative shift to, as you say, when you made that point around therapy, when people look back on the challenges in their lives, very often they will say, well, actually, that was the best thing that could have happened because, I learned to do this, or I realized that person was not right for me, or I realized that I needed to change something. It's a very profound, as you say, therapeutic lesson in the thought that viewed, again, this is the way the gods view it, from above, and with a view that goes over time, that we see events in a different light, and the challenges that we meet at one time bring out or develop us in a certain way, and prepare us for other things, and prepare us for the next stage of our life. So he says, but you make the point that he also adds this idea around destiny. Of course, that's a key Stoic idea, that because we're in this this cosmos that is a very close network, or woven garment, if you like, of cause and effect, that things happen in a way that is not random, and that means that that must shape our attitude to the events that take place. That's the point I think he's making.
Yeah, and the very fact that we're good is because of that whole network of things. So we can't really say it's not fair when X, Y, and Z happen, because I've become a good person as some sort of, through some way, because of an interaction of all the things that have happened around me, sort of thing. Yeah.
We've got to acknowledge that it's only good for the survivors, of course. Like the survivors of the bad things that happen. There's a percentage of people don't survive. It's not good for them.
Yeah, well, he will say that, death's not a terrible thing. So he kind of spends some time with that at the end, doesn't he? But I think you made that point, Judith, too. Like, we don't like to talk about death very much, but you didn't know if you were, virtuous or not until you died, and how you died. And you can see that very strongly in here. He spends the whole last paragraph really going on about how you really need to make friends with the idea of death. I mean, otherwise you can't really make the kind of therapeutic change that we're talking about here. Death is not a bad thing. It's a freedom and all that sort of stuff.
So your true character will only be revealed at the moment of your death. He's sort of implying the way you die is going to be the ultimate measure.
Well, I mean, you could die badly, for example. You could live well and then suddenly fall to pieces when the emperor threatens you with hanging or something. But here, in this section, he says he invokes the medical analogy to support part of his argument too, and I think it's really neat. And reading Nussbaum too, she was really remarking about how important the medical analogy is for Seneca. And here we see it really well kind of displayed, because he says, if you're surprised that misfortune is an advantage, discomfort and misfortune and the like, then you will also be surprised at any man being benefited by the knife and cautery, or by hunger and thirst as well. So, we can imagine that we would imagine that being cut up with a knife is a really bad thing, but actually surgery can be a really good thing, because it puts a person back together and cures them. And then he mentions this wonderful saying of Demetrius, which I thought is really cool. Demetrius says, "No one," said he, "seems to me more unhappy than the man whom no misfortune has ever befallen. He never has had an opportunity of testing himself, though everything has happened to him according to his wish. Nay, even before he has formed a wish, yet the gods have judged him unfavorably." See, that's really important, because there's that destined thing again, right? He has never been deemed worthy to conquer ill fortune, which avoids the greatest cowards, as though it said, "Why should I take that man for my antagonist? He will straightway lay down his arms. I shall not need all my strength against him. He will put to flight by a mere menace. He dares not even face me. Let me look around for some other with whom I may fight hand to hand. I blush to join battle with one who is prepared to be beaten." So this apparently is Fortune's attitude towards picking an opponent, and so you're lucky to be picked by Fortune, because it means it singled you out as a worthy opponent.
It's a stretch. Yeah.
But then, as you see, we have these and you're probably going to talk about this, Courtney, but these exemplar, so the instances of people in Roman history who have gone through these terrible things, and this was part of Roman moral education, was to think about what these people have been through. Mucius by fire, Fabricius by poverty, Rutilius by exile, Regulus by torture, Socrates by poison, Cato by death. It is ill fortune alone that discovers these glorious examples. So that's the bottom line, We don't read about the people who never had a problem in their whole life. We never find out about those people. And to be honest, those people are very rare.
That's true.
I mean, part of the issue here is that, the person who never faces any adversity whatsoever is a very rare person. But again, this part of moral education is understanding what people have been through previously, and that's what was hammered home, I think, here by Seneca.
And it's a very, in a way, if we follow it through, it's a very kind of existential view, and it also draws on that kind of common opinion. He says nobody would choose to be, I think he says it in this section, right? He says nobody would choose to be Mykenus, the anxious man who can't even sleep on his downy pillow. Nobody would choose to be like that. They would definitely would rather be someone like a Regulus, someone who has sacrificed themselves for their honor, that they're a virtuous person. Anyone can see that that's a much better kind of person to be than the other one. But there's this idea too that, and it brings home Epictetus's kind of point of view, really, that it's the views that we have of things that make all the difference. And this is really drawing on the importance of the rational part to produce the virtuous character in the example. And if a person can take the right view and put virtue first, as opposed to these other things, like external things and the like, then they can transform their lives and make themselves happy and excellent under any situation. So basically, we're really talking about the difference between like Schopenhauer's view that the world is a shithole and a sucky place, and you must have done something horrible in the past life, to actually switching it around because of your ability to do so. There's this fundamental rational part that allows us to completely switch it around and say, no, this is the way to live. And Seneca is saying, and it plays out better for the human being who decides to do that, because misfortune will find you anyway. So you're either going to suffer and hate your life and be a miserable person to be around, or you're going to suffer at times, but turn it into a wonderful way of really celebrating your life and being a wonderful example of a human being. I think it's wonderful.
It sort of implies that the charismatic, theatrical type people are going to have a better run, doesn't it? It's sort of saying that. They're the ones who are going to make a big show and dance about it and have a great death and always be remembered.
Kind of yes and no. I think, and I guess, well, part of our view of all this is, and part of, I guess, Schopenhauer's view of all this was coloured in the meantime by, 2,000 years of Christianity, and the idea that and martyrdom, right? Martyrdom was the thing in Christianity, and so in a sense that the that idea about suffering and dying for your beliefs kind of supervened on this suffering and dying because of virtue. So but anyway, but so there were these two kind of traditions, both of which I suppose Schopenhauer was kind of ignoring or preferring not to look at when he basically judged life as meaningless and purely suffering anyway, ignoring, as I say, this tradition. And of course, it's important to recognize that this particular work of Seneca's totally fed into the Christian tradition. So insofar as Seneca is addressing the problem of evil, the Christian theorists were very, very happy to take it over and adapt it somewhat to their own purposes. So this is in the background, I guess, of those 2,000 years, just with a somewhat different emphasis as to what the right things to die for are. But yeah, I think it's really powerful. I think we do learn from example, and we do learn from the sufferings of people who have gone before us, and that's what's that does make part of a moral education. And also, I mean, to give a sort of a more modern parallel, I guess, we do read about people who suffered in the Holocaust, for instance, or Viktor Frankl, who went through Auschwitz and came out with a renewed understanding of what it is to be human, or people who went through those things, or people who didn't survive those terrible situations, or who made life better for their fellow inmates in concentration camps or gulags. So in a sense, we do learn, we do have the capacity for moral examples even today, I guess.
Yeah, and thinking about the therapy in the background, of course, too, we could think of Mike Kennis, or how you pronounce his name, the guy who's having trouble sleeping on his downy cushion, the anxious man. And as a modern therapy, we'd probably try and think about his genetics and neurochemistry and what kind of medication he might use, or cognitive behavioral techniques to help him manage his distress better. But what we're seeing through this exemplar is that it might just be caused by his misuse of reason, which has led him astray throughout. And so by having the right view of things and using reason correctly, it gives us a world of meaning that is healthy and natural and so on. So I think like you say, it's a moral education, but it's also a technique, it's a technique, it's a therapeutic formula that tells us it's a diagnosis of the dangers of pleasure, for example, in Mike Kennis's case, and also the benefits of living well and living critically and rationally. Yeah. And finally, he mentions Socrates' example, but just before that, I have often thought, when I've been thinking about the Stoic therapy, that it can't be merely pragmatic, even though it would work. Like, in a sense, we could say, if to act this way, I'm thinking in sort of what's the word, as opposed to acting or believing the world is a penitentiary, like Schopenhauer suggests, but rather by believing that the world is a place in which there is not some sort of what do you call it, like essentially evil and hostile environment that we have to kind of endure until we die, but rather, a pragmatic kind of view. If it were only a pragmatism and we could just see things the way that we wish to see them, that might be enough. But what we see throughout this too is that it's not a pragmatism. It transcends that. It's because Regulus, for example, focuses on what really matters, not on some random kind of distracting thing, but rather he's focusing on what really matters. And he says here, it consoles the latter that he suffers for the sake of honor, i.e. virtue, and he looks away from his torments to the cause. And that word cause, I think, is really important, because we're talking about a physical description of the cosmos, where there are only bodies, and the bodies act on one another and are acted upon in turn. So there's this cause and effect relationship going on everywhere. And instead of focusing on the torture, the pain that he's experiencing when he's it sounds like he's in some sort of contraption that drives nails into him or something. Instead of focusing on that, his mind looks away towards the cause of his suffering. And the cause of his suffering is not the nails that are being driven into his flesh, but rather his virtue. That's why he's there in the first place. And so if a person knows that they haven't done wrong, then it's much easier to suffer, because their mind is instead focusing on the virtue, the fact that they're there because they're a good person. And that's a consolation, and a neat one.
Innocence is the foil against suffering.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
Well, goodness is the cure. So the example of Socrates, right, is kind of a summary of that. Socrates, what does he say? Do you consider Socrates to have been badly used because he took the draft which the state assigned to him, as though it were a charm to make him immortal, and argued about death until death itself? Was he ill-treated because his blood froze and the current of his veins gradually stopped as the chill of death crept over him? How much more is this man to be envied than he who is served on precious stones, whose drink a creature trained to every vice a eunuch, or much the same, cools with snow in a golden cup. Such men as these bring up again all that they drink in misery and disgust, and taste of their own bile, while Socrates cheerfully and willingly drains his own poison, or his poison. And, you know, later on, he makes this interesting observation, which really struck me, that the stomach that bursts from gluttony, for example, is a much, much more painful way to die than to die from starvation or some other kind of deprivation. And what he's really saying there is that, you know, Socrates' death, where he gets to be around his friends and think about, you know, virtue, would be nothing compared to the man who has to vomit up his own bile and blood because of his own stupidity and his own lust for pleasure. That kind of death would be incredibly not only embarrassing, but, you know, humiliating and petty and small and terrible and also painful. Yeah.
And they would have a sense of self-righteousness. This shouldn't be happening to me. Like, I'm wealthy. I'm fucking, yes, entitled.
Yeah. There's a kind of a genre of you know, like drug lords getting arrested while in their underwear or whatever. It's kind of like, yeah, basically, you know, these people who think that they have some kind of charm, I guess, to evade normal norms of justice. You know, the amusing thing is, well, actually they don't, and nemesis will attend them whether they're ready or not.
Seems that way. Yeah.
Your turn, Judith, for the next part.
Okay, so section 4. So this is kind of, again, we get a bit of a sense of, again, Seneca gestures to the image of the Olympic Games, you know, this very powerful athletic imagery that he's mentioned before. And he says, you know, he pretends that Lasalius, that kind of doubt-riven bureaucrat in charge of Sicily, he pretends that Lasalius has made it to the Olympic Games. So how should Lasalius think of himself as he's got to the Olympics? I do not congratulate you as I would a brave man, but as one who has obtained a consulship or praetorship. These are the heights of normal Roman ambition, a consulship or a praetorship. You have gained dignity. I may say the same of a good man. That's to say, any good man. If troublesome circumstances have never given him a single opportunity of displaying the strength of his mind, I think you unhappy because you have never been unhappy. This is a kind of a juxtaposition, a kind of a rhetorical expression here. So someone who's never had any challenges is basically living in a fool's paradise. We see this in, you know, we meet people from time to time who haven't had what we might consider normal challenges in life, and we think, oh my goodness, what's going to happen when you do meet those challenges? We know that they're going to have a hard time. For a man cannot know himself without a trial. No one ever learnt what he could do without putting himself to the test. Great men, I say, often rejoice at crosses of fortune, just as brave soldiers do at wars. I remember to have heard Triumphus, who was a gladiator in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, complaining about the scarcity of prizes. What a glorious time, said he, is past. So this Triumphus, who was a gladiator, thought that the great period was gone. You know, he wanted more challenges. Valor is greedy of danger, and we see this. You know, it's possibly a personality type. We see this with people who are thrill seekers. You know, they might be bungee jumpers or they might be base jumpers. You know, there are some people who just want to push the envelope and who just want more challenge. Those those who return unwounded from battle may have done as bravely, yet he who returns wounded is more admired. And I think there's a reference there to Plato's Theaetetus, which is a dialogue where it's very dramatic. It starts where this young man, Theaetetus, he's being actually carried in from literally from the battlefield, where he's been wounded, fighting for Athens, and then there's this huge flashback with Socrates and other people talking about, oh, you know, how incredible he was as a student. So it's like this idea that somebody can be incredibly impressive, but ultimately it's how it's their performance in the battle, and the battle, of course, is life. You know, this is an image that Seneca uses all the time in his letter: life as a forum for battle. God, I say, favors those whom he wishes to enjoy the greatest honors. Whenever he affords them the means of performing some exploit with spirit and courage, something which is not easily to be accomplished. You can judge of a pilot in a storm, of a soldier in a battle. How can I know with how great a spirit you could endure poverty if you overflow with riches? How, and there's a whole series of these rhetorical questions. How, and this is kind of particularly challenging for us, how can I know how calmly you would endure to be childless if you see all your children around you? What Seneca's getting at is, you know, what if your children were to die, as Seneca's only child, as we understand, died, and of course, as with child mortality in ancient Rome was a thing, you know. How do I know how you would cope with that adversity if you've never endured it? And so then there's this suggestion that people who've never had these challenges are, you know, we have no reason to respect them. The recruit turns pale at the thought of a wound, but the veteran, who knows that he has often won the victory after losing blood, looks boldly at his own flowing gore. In like manner, God hardens, reviews, and exercises those whom he tests and loves. Those whom he seems to indulge and spare, he is keeping out of condition to meet their coming misfortunes. For you are mistaken if you suppose that anyone is exempt from misfortune. He who has long prospered will have his share some day. Those who seem to have been spared them have only had them put off. And so, you know, people complain. The general has dealt hardly with me. No, he has judged well of me. So if you're going through a big struggle, that means the gods have judged you worthy of it. And this is the whole idea around anticipating the bad things that are likely to happen, premeditatio malorum. This is what we must anticipate in our lives.
And the genius here too is that he can take something that on the one hand we would go, oh no, I don't want terrible things to happen to me, but then he has a way of presenting them that we can't help but agree with, because, oh, well, if you're a person in the army and you're selected for a dangerous and potentially awful mission, what does that say about you? You know, like, it's like, oh yeah, it says I'm really capable.
Yeah, exactly. So special forces, you know, you don't just get to be in the special forces because you want to be. You have to go through a particularly horrendous training course in order to get there. You know, it's not given to every soldier to become a special forces soldier. You know, it's the elite. It's the people who can endure the most exquisite challenges that their trainers can devise for them. So, you know, and again, we can see it that way. And then finally, Seneca refers to the Lacedaemonians, who, of course, are Spartans. So what do they do for their kids? Well, they train them with the most horrendous upbringing. As he says, there can be no easy proof of virtue. Fortune lashes and mangles us. Well, let us endure it. It is not cruelty. And this is this idea around, people tend to think that there's some kind of imbalance or injustice if they themselves are suffering something challenging. Well, what Seneca is trying to say is there's not an imbalance. There is, in fact, a balance. It's a divine justice. Fortune lashes us and mangles us. Well, let us endure it. Is not a cruelty. It is a struggle in which the oftener we engage, the braver we shall become. There's a virtuous cycle here, he says. The more that we endure, the better placed we are to endure the next round. And as he says, the bodies of sailors are hardened by endurance of the sea, and the hands of farmers by work. This is why, you know, people with experience are valued in the workplace, because they have been through the challenges. They know what to expect. They know how to cope. You may
Just
see
before, just before that bit, I can see you're marching on towards the end of the passage. That's all. Just in the middle bit, can I say something? I was just curious about, because I really like it. I really love the way it's put, and I'm thinking it's a lovely piece of therapy again, because nowadays you'll come across modern therapy. They'll say something like, you know, if we have too many good things and too much pleasure, it builds up a kind of dependence on, you know, whatever dopamine or serotonin, neurochemistry in the brain, which softens you. It doesn't soften you in the modern way of talking about it, but you become dependent on it. And he says something very similar in here. He says, avoid luxury, avoid effeminate enjoyment, by which men's minds are softened, and in which, unless something occurs to remind them of the common lot of humanity, they lie unconscious, as though plunged in continual drunkenness. And this is like as good a critique then as it is now. He whom glazed windows have always guarded from the wind, whose feet are warmed by constantly renewed fomentations, whose dining room is heated by hot air beneath the floor and spread through the walls, cannot meet the gentlest breeze without danger. While all excesses are hurtful, excesses of comfort is the most hurtful of all. It affects the brain. It leads men's minds into vain imaginings. It spreads a thick cloud over the boundaries of truth and falsehood. Is it not better with virtue by one side to endure continual misfortune than to burst with an endless surfeit of good things? It's really good. I mean, I worked in construction, and I remember we got a gig for a while where we were installing these heated elements under people's bathroom floors, so that when they got out of their bath, their floor would be warm to the touch. Like, and I hadn't read Stoicism at that point, but I just remember thinking, why the hell would anyone go to all the trouble of putting a heated element under the floor of their bathroom?
Damn, effeminate enjoyments, eh?
Well, the weird thing is, you know,
oh dear.
Until the 20th century, people didn't understand the extent of Roman engineering, so they didn't really get it that the Romans did have underfloor heating. So it's only in the 20th or 21st centuries we realized, oh yeah, they really did have this level of luxury, which allowed their moralists to moralize about the decadence involved.
But it's so appropriate. I mean, like, you think maybe it's just a thing that I have, but I just think like the level of luxury that we subject ourselves to now it has made luxury invisible. Like, it's ubiquitous. Everybody is absolutely comfortable all the time. Everything's air conditioned. They freak out when the air conditioning doesn't work, or their car doesn't have good air conditioning, or whatever. A multitude of luxuries. Like, if I don't own a jet ski, I'm sort of missing out in some way. Like, I should write a letter to the government because I don't have a jet ski. You know, it's almost as silly as that, unfortunately.
It is. And then we have luxury beliefs. You know, that new book the guy in America wrote, Luxury Beliefs. See that? That's a pretty good conservative right on, you know, the whole left-wing mania promoted by people. He calls them luxury beliefs, because these people are so well cared for in there, but that they promote outrageous political policies because they're completely insulated from the effects of some of the policies they promote. He just calls them luxury beliefs, often held by quite wealthy or middle class people that are out of touch with, the knock-on effects that the lower classes are going to feel from them. So
yeah, and I mean, personally, I don't want to say anything too political, but I can definitely say that if we become overly dependent on being comfortable all the time, just like he's saying here, that definitely cannot be a good thing. That just cannot be a good thing. And it also changes. Well, it means that we are concerned for things that aren't actually relevant. So we spend our time, for example, working to meet needs that otherwise wouldn't have existed.
Yes,
we spend our time
right.
inventing, complexes and psychological conditions that may or may not even exist. They may be, they may have something to do with the fact that we live such artificial lives nowadays, for example. So anyway,
you get hypnotized with the multiplicity of choices of all the meaningless things, like 10 rows of cereal in the supermarket, while all the big choices are getting deleted, all getting ready for the Great Reset, apparently.
Yeah, and it you feel like if I don't, because I'm so accustomed to having most of the things I want all the time, that given the long laundry list of things that I have access to and the things that I have, if I miss out on one of those things on the list, for example, a high-paying job, well, then I feel like my life is meaningless and I failed drastically in some ways. So they're the kind of dangers that come with this
luxury.
worldview. But Judith, you were just getting to the tree metaphor, I believe. I'll let you carry on. Sorry.
The tree metaphor? Was I getting to that?
Tree metaphor.
Oh yes, no tree which the wind does not often blow against is firm and strong, for it is stiffened by the very act of being shaken, and plants its roots more securely. Those which grow in a sheltered valley are brittle, and so it is the advantage of good men, and cause them to be undismayed, that they should live much amidst alarms, and learn to bear with patience what is not evil, save to him who endures it ill. So yeah, it's a powerful image of if you've been above the snow line, or in a mountainous area, and you see the trees and they're buffeted by the winds, and they're sort of, I won't say misshapen, but they are shapen by the prevailing conditions. And that's how they grow. That's how they've adapted. And I guess Seneca's point is, we are like those trees, buffeted by the winds and the weather, and adapting. Yeah, we must adapt. And that's part of the successful, which is the virtuous life, is to adapt to those prevailing winds.
And sacrifice some of our inner aesthetic beauty in the name of survival.
Yeah, exactly right. Because the trees that are buffeted by the winds, they're not the most beautiful specimens. Often they're kind of a bit shrunken or a bit distorted, but they're successful. They're living in these challenging conditions, as should be our aim.
And you say in an aesthetic condition, Johnny, but I would say that Seneca's view is that because we turn inward and away from the external world, and we're constantly vigilant and doing this self-examination, the inner world opens up to us, and that's where we do in fact find beauty. So we may not be beautiful or concerned with external shows of beauty, but we've made our inner nature, inner self, quite a beautiful and habitable place.
That's true. That makes sense. Yeah, it is true. It's very easy to get distracted and just think it's all about out there. And even as you say, the job or the partner or the monetary situation is so much more paramount than doing that work, that inner work, which means you respond well to situations, you respond wisely and with kindness and all that sort of stuff, which is it is a different type of beauty, isn't it?
Yeah, and imagine, you know, you, instead of being concerned about things on the outside, that you end your day where you've had a good day and you've done everything pretty well, and you turn your attention inwards and you reflect on maybe there's some things that you have to change, but there must be a general feeling of tranquility and lightness because of the kind of person that you find yourself to be at the end of the day. That's quite nice.
It's true.
So part 5, God has the same purpose, we learn now, as the wise man. And I think here we're seeing, because we're getting towards the end of the argument, and he's showing us now a bit more of his intention, you know, like Shannon was talking about before. He starts out sort of trying to win us over rather than dealing with this whole issue of theodicy in some sort of formal technical way, and instead now he's going to bring in his Stoic ideas about externals and the like, I think, a bit more. So God has the same purpose as the wise man, that is, to prove that the things which the herd covets and dreads are neither good nor bad in themselves. If, however, he only bestows them upon good men, it will be evident that they are good things and bad, if he only inflicts them upon bad men. So we get the idea that riches and those sort of things that the masses call good are equally available to the good and the bad alike, so they can't possibly be a good thing, right? They're just indifferent things. So then he says that labor calls for the best man. He's talking about labor at some point this here. Here we go. I think this is an interesting point he makes. He says, he makes this interesting kind of comparison about work, right? He says, where does it get to? He says, it is unjust that a good man should be enfeebled or transfixed or chained, while bad men swagger at large with a whole skin. And he says, what? Is it not unjust that brave men should bear arms, pass the night in camps, and stand on guard along the rampart with their wounds still bandaged, while within the city eunuchs and professional profligates live at their ease? Is it not unjust that maidens of the highest birth should be roused at night to perform divine service, while fallen women enjoy the sound of sleep? It's not unjust, is it? It's labor calls for the best. He says, man, it's people, because he's talking about women as well. The Senate often passes the whole day in debate, while at the same time every scoundrel either amuses his leisure in the Campus Martius or lurks in a tavern or passes his time in some pleasant society. The same things happen in this great commonwealth, you know, the entire world. Good men labor, spend, and are spent, and that too of their own free will. They are not dragged along by fortune, but follow her and take equal steps with her. If they knew how, they would outstrip her. I remember also to have heard this spirited saying of that stoutest hearted of men. Here we go, we get Demetrius again, who's a bit of a hardcore guy. Do we know much about Demetrius? He's a bit of a cynic, is he?
Yeah, he was, I'm pretty sure he was exiled from Rome alongside people like Musonius Rufus, and kind of in that period, he was totally hardcore. And I think he, I may be getting mixed up with someone else, but I think he was one of those philosophers who routinely got exiled because he wouldn't shut up.
All right. Well, we wouldn't be surprised by the description of his speeches, because here we've got Demetrius saying, "Ye immortal gods, the only complaint which I have to make of you is that you did not make your will known to me earlier, for then I would sooner have gone into that state of life to which I now have been called. Do you wish to take my children? It was for you that I brought them up. Do you wish to take some part of my body? Take it. it is no great thing that I am offering you. I shall have done with the whole of it. Oh, sorry. I shall soon have done with the whole of it. Do you wish for my life? Why should I hesitate to return to you what you gave me? Whatever you ask, you shall receive with my good will. Nay, I would rather give it than be forced to hand it over to you. What need had you to take it away? Take away what you did. You might have received it from me, yet even as it is, you cannot take anything from me, because you cannot rob a man unless he resists. And this is the interesting almost paradox with Stoicism, is that on the one side, with all this talk about training and working hard to kind of develop this tonos, this shape of character. But on the other hand, in a completely different way, there's this radical acceptance that I ought to wish that whatever happens was what I wished in the first place to happen.
Yeah, I think it's one of those seeming contradictions or seeming conflicts which Stoicism is so rife with, but also which reflect, a real tension in human life. I mean, that's the thing. We should resist on behalf of what is virtuous, but at the same time, ultimately, we need to recognize what's likely to happen and what's, I suppose, fated to happen in the Stoic view. We are that dog tied to the cart ultimately, in Zeno and Chrysippus's famous image. So at a certain point, we have to recognize what it is that is confronting us.
Yeah, and this idea, right, of radical acceptance about what happens in the external world is set up in contrast with what actually matters. And what actually matters is the right use of reason, which is always within our power. And that's why I cannot be robbed unless I resist, because it's up to me to use with my reason appropriately. So if my life is about to be taken from me, well, then I cannot be robbed of it if I desire to give my life to the one who gave it to me in the first place. And so that way I go willingly and I die well, as opposed to, like you were saying before, Judith, fail in the last moment of my life to live according to nature, so to speak.
Create the serenity within to accept the things you can't change. That's right.
So he says, I am constrained to nothing. I suffer nothing against my will, nor am I God's slave, but his willing follower. And there's that radical acceptance. And so much the more because I know that everything is ordained and proceeds according to a law that endures forever. So there's that destiny. The fate guides us, and the fates guide us. And the length of every man's days is decided at the first hour of his birth. Every cause depends upon some earlier cause. One long chain of destiny decides all things public or private. Wherefore everything must be patiently endured, because events do not fall in our way as we imagine, but come by regular law. It has long ago been settled at what you should rejoice and at what you should weep. And although the lives of individual men appear to differ from one another in a great variety of particulars, yet the sum total comes to one and the same thing. And here's the big view from above, the objective truth. We soon perish, and the gifts which we receive soon perish. Why then should we be angry? Why should we lament? We are prepared for our fate. Let nature deal as she will with her own bodies. They don't belong to us. Let us be cheerful whatever befalls, and stoutly reflect that it is not anything of our own that perishes. What is the duty of a good man? To submit himself to fate. It is a great consolation to be swept away together with the entire universe, whatever law is laid upon us, that thus we must live and thus we must die, is laid upon the gods also. So there's that relationship. One unchangeable stream bears along men and gods alike, the creator and the ruler of the universe himself, though he has given laws to the fates, yet is guided by them. He always obeys, he only once commanded. Now that's really interesting, right? That idea. Even God obeys and only one time commanded. So we're the same as God, and that was that idea that there's very little difference between us and the gods except in time. I think you said, Judith.
Yeah, that's right. And this is why this particular essay on Providence was kind of mined and exploited by the Christians, but they absolutely balked at that bit, that God, Zeus or the creator God, was also bound by the dictates of fate or necessity or nature or whatever. So that was an element that was completely unacceptable to the people,
Makes sense.
to the Christian theorists who took over this essay De Providentia, which was incredibly influential. But that was one thing they couldn't quite come at, that God also was subject to the dictates of nature or fate.
He set in motion universal principles that everyone has to obey. It's a sort of it's a type of euphemistic fatalism, or figurative. It's a figurative fatalism. It's not, because some people would read it and think, oh, everything's set in motion from the time you're born. It's a fatalistic flow of events, and why should I be worried because everything's preordained? It's sort of not really saying that, is it? It's just saying that the rules are preordained. The structure of the nature of what works well and what doesn't work well is sort of preordained as such. And if you follow certain spiritual principles or ways of behaving, your death is fine. It's not, you don't die at the wrong time, or nothing's a bad outcome in a sense, because if you're following those tenets, then that's doing the best with what the situation gives, I guess. I guess the Christians wouldn't like that, because they would assume that God can change his mind at certain times and intervene and create miracles. And
yeah, there's no God that can intervene in this picture. But I'm not an expert on this fate stuff, but it basically seems to go that everything is fated. Everything. And
it's not talking about specifics, is it? It's talking about
it is.
that in your whole reel out of your life storyline,
everything.
It's fated. The actual specifics of the occurrences are fated.
It seems to be the way
this is where it gets very difficult, because so I think the sort of standard view nowadays that the Stoics were what we call compatibilists. So they believed in a strict causal nexus between everything that happens, but at the same time they were very insistent on the power of human reason to make decisions and undertake actions and assess impressions in order to make a correct decision. So insofar as those two things are compatible, that's what the Stoics believed. So
they believed you could alter we are agents in our life, and we alter the trajectory. So that doesn't sound like a fated thing, does it?
Well, I wouldn't say alter of trajectory. I would say, that's where it gets very difficult. But I suppose what I would say is that the Stoic position is a kind of, to some extent, a common sense one, in the sense that we can all recognize that there are multitude of factors influencing how we approach our everyday decisions. On the other hand, the common sense position is also that we have agency, and that we can choose to do A, or we can choose to do B. And those two positions, such as they are, were both maintained by the Stoics. So that's why we can say that they had a compatibilist position. They believed in a strictly causal network of cosmic action, but they also believed in a supreme power of human decision making to ideally choose a virtuous course of proceeding. So those two things are kind of fundamental to the Stoic worldview, and at the same time that seems kind of contradictory, but at the same time it also seems intuitively what we would all think anyway.
And even that is, I think, hard to, I think it's a really complicated subject. Like, for example, one way I think Sellers puts in his neat little book a kind of simple example where he says, imagine you got sick and maybe you've got some sort of disease. So rather than saying, well, it's all fated, so there's no point going to the doctor, I'll either get better or not, the Stoic view would be something more like, well, if you decided to go to the doctor, would also be one of the fated things that would calculate into whether you get better or not. So there's not only external causes which affect you from outside, it's also the state of your own soul, which is a cause in itself. So there's an interaction between other causes and your inner cause, your use of reason, for example. If your soul is not in a perfect kind of structural kind of alignment, or whatever you want to call it, like tonos and all those sorts of things, then the ways in which that you will be caused to move by outside forces will be haphazard and not in alignment with nature. But on the other hand, if you've perfectly kind of trained yourself and honed your substance so that it's perfectly formed and in tune with things, then when you're struck by an impression, you will take the impression to be as it actually is and move in a fated, in a way that accords with what it is, with the nature of things. So I think it's even tricky to talk about choice, because for us, experientially, it feels like choice, but from the cosmic point of view, it's not like that, is the way I read it. That's my understanding. Does that make sense, Judith, or did I make a mishmash of it?
No, I think you're right. On the other hand, I think there's a pragmatism involved where this, the Stoics were fine with whatever the latest is in medical science. So, for instance, Marcus Aurelius obviously relied on Galen. Now, Galen was not a Stoic; he was a Platonist, but there's a pragmatism around, well, whatever the best advice is at the time and the situation you've got, you go with, because and this comes back to the primary Stoic horme or impetus, as they put it, the primary instinct is the preservation of life. Now, if you're going to get the best advice, well, you get the best advice towards your preservation of life, and whatever the doctors say you're going to do. So there's that as well. I think it's a kind of it's a realist position rather than anything else, recognizing that there is rather this complex of cause and effect that we're all subject to all the time, obviously, but at the same time we do have agency around our decision making, and that includes our decisions around our health, and our decisions around our health ideally are made so as to preserve our lives in the best possible manner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way I was describing it is looking at it from the somatic point of view, this idea of substance, but you can look at it propositionally. That's the other way of looking at it, and that's how Nussbaum seems to break them up. And really, that's just saying that whether I go to the doctor or not depends on the knowledge I have about doctors and the benefits of going, and so on and so forth. So it's really a rational approach, because if I have the right information and the right knowledge at the right time, then I will act accordingly and do the right thing. Otherwise, I might not. And all those things depend on causes, whether or not I know those sorts of things or not, and whether I'm close to a doctor, for example. Well, that's probably not going to factor in so much to the Stoic account because it's interested in knowledge and those internal things. But anyway, yeah, interesting conversation. So just we're right at the end now, and of this section, and he says, and I love this bit. I read it to my 10-year-old daughter, and she said, "I don't know what." She didn't say that. She said, "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." She's only 10. So and it says his course. He's talking about the man of the good man, the strong man. His course will not be straightforward. He must go upwards and downwards, be tossed about, and guide his vessel through troubled waters. He must make his way in spite of fortune. He will meet with much that is hard, which he must soften, much that is rough, that he must make smooth. Fire tries gold, misfortune tries brave men. See how high virtue has to climb? You may be sure that it has no safe path to tread. And then he does this really. Is this his poem, or did he get it from somewhere else, Judith? Do you know?
I think it's from Ovid, the great Roman poet, who was just amazing. Who he really created this beautiful Latin poetry. It's about faith on the son S-O-N of the sun god S-U-N, who wanted to drive. His friends were teasing him. Can you drive your dad's car, essentially? And so he undertook to drive his father's chariot. Didn't go well.
And the interesting thing about it, to tie it into this notion that appears here in Seneca, and I think this is where it starts to appear, that in some ways the wise man can become greater than God. Here we have the gods fearing the outcome of something. That's what's going on. The father did not cease from trying to scare his brave spirit with terrors. There's this, and Seneca picks up on this, and he says, I'm encouraged by these things with which you think to scare me. I long to stand where the sun himself trembles to stand. It is the part of grovelers and cowards to follow the safe track. Courage loves a lofty path. So he's really saying, I don't think he means it literally, but we could take it, metaphorically, that the sun is cautious or scared or whatever of what could happen. But the wise man doesn't even need that, because the wise man can go beyond that. And later he will say the gods are already beyond. They're already above fear. They don't have to worry about those sorts of things. But the wise man goes beyond it. I think it's the same kind of idea here, expressed beautifully. Part 6, Judith.
Okay, so, but the question remains. He comes back to this question: why? Why does this still happen? Good thing. Why does God permit evil to happen to good men? He does not permit it. This is the interesting twist that Seneca's putting on. He does not permit it. He takes away from them all evils, such as crimes and scandalous wickedness, daring thoughts, grasping schemes, blind lusts, and avarice, coveting its neighbor's goods. He protects and saves them. It's a twist on the whole idea. He's not suffering good men to endure bad things. They don't, because they just don't endure bad things. Sometimes, yes, good men are put to death. Well, what complaint can be made? Some men have the veneer of a good life, but it's just a veneer. And when something happens to shake and unmask them, we can see how deep and real a rottenness was hidden by that factitious magnificence. But to the virtuous, sorry.
Just that bit though about the before you get too far ahead, because I think it's an interesting part where he mentions what happens to the good men. That he says the good man. Because that's right at the beginning, isn't it? He says, God permits that to happen to a good man, which a good man sometimes chooses should happen to himself. I think there's a lot in that. Good men, you say, lose their children. Why should they not? Since sometimes they even put them to death. They are banished. Why should they not? Since sometimes they leave their country of their own free will, never to return. They are slain. Why not? Since sometimes they choose to lay violent hands on themselves. He's really saying that how can these things that we call bad happen when the good man chooses them for himself? And there can't be a contradiction. The man will sometimes commit suicide if virtue is at stake. So that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So if you think that any of those things, exile, death, loss of children, are bad, well, guess what? The good man willingly does those things to himself, so they can't possibly be bad. It's a really clever argument, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Courtney. And it's, of course, key to the Stoic idea that these things like the death of children or the loss of fortune or whatever, they are indifference ultimately. They're irrelevant ultimately to whether we have a virtuous life or not. 100%. Yeah. So we've got this idea of the veneer, the people who seem to be successful. Basically, it's a veneer. And of course, we know that's the case. We know that sometimes people who seem to be successful in life, it's just a sham. And sooner or later, the reality emerges and they're absolutely in chaos, or they can't pay their bills, or their marriage is a disaster, or their children hate them, or whatever. So yes, these veneers happen all the time. So, and again, he kind of presents he's as if he's responding from the interlocutor. Yet many things befall you which are sad, dreadful, hard to be borne. Well, as I've not been able to remove these from your path, I've given your minds, and this is God talking, right? I've given your minds strength to combat all, bear them bravely. In this you can surpass God himself. He is beyond suffering evil. You are above it. Despise poverty. No man lives as poor as he was born. Despise pain. Either it will cease or you will cease. Despise death. It either ends you or takes you elsewhere. Despise fortune. I have given her no weapon that can reach the mind. Above all, I have taken care that no one should hold you captive against your will. The way of escape lies open before you. If you do not choose to fight, you may fly. So there's always an option. There's always, for the Stoics, there's always the open door, as Epictetus calls it. It's the option of suicide. It's not an option you take lightly. As Socrates was, he was the soldier at his post. He didn't choose to die, but it was forced on him. We don't choose that option, but ultimately it's there if we need it.
It's very similar. It's very similar to the Discourses 1.1, where he talks about what Zeus has given us. And sorry to jump back just half a paragraph. He says, because I think this all rides on the rational part, where he's really, really saying, look what you've got. These guys have got this veneer. They've got the decadent life, the gold, the silver, the ivory, all that stuff. But that's nothing. Look what you've got. To you I have given sure and lasting good things, which become greater and better the more one turns them over and views them on every side. I have granted to you to scorn danger, to disdain passion. Here's the Stoic stuff all the way through. You do not shine outwardly. All your good qualities are turned inwards. Even so does the world neglect what lies without it. You do not shine outwardly. All your good qualities are turned inwards. Even so does the world neglect what lies outwardly. All your good qualities. What? Hang on. My brain's falling asleep. Even so does the world neglect what lies without it, and rejoices in the contemplation of itself. Sorry about that. I have placed every good thing within your own breast. It is your own good fortune not to need any good fortune. That's it, hey? That's the whole crux. I have placed every good thing within your breast. It is your good fortune not to need any good fortune. And we remember Nussbaum, I think in chapter 2 or 3, says it's a battle between, for the philosophers, between Tukey and Tekman, that the philosopher is supposed to extricate themselves from the wheel of fortune through the use of their philosophical argument. And that language is exactly what he uses here. It is your good fortune not to need any good fortune. And we see it also in the Gorgias, right? No, Euthydemus, where he says, Socrates is having that conversation and he says, what is the best thing, the best good thing that you could have? Oh, it's good fortune, isn't it? And he's like, no, actually, good fortune is the best thing, but he basically boils it down to wisdom. And so we don't actually, if you've got wisdom, you don't actually need things to go well in the external world. So yeah, brilliant. And sorry to jump in like that, Judith, but yeah, I notice when it comes to a therapy of Stoicism, it's all about, it always comes back to that, what Epictetus emphasizes so much, that what is up to me, that rational part. If I'm in that rational part, if I completely identify with that rational part, then I can accept everything else, whether it's there or not. Even your breath or the motion of your body is a gift that is given to you moment to moment, projected across time, and is enough for me, as Marcus Aurelius says. Sorry. So keep going.
Well said, Courtney. Yeah. So do but watch. This is on the last page of the text. Do but watch, and you will see how short and how ready a path leads to freedom. And of course, freedom is one of those things that Epictetus talks about all the time, because he was a slave and he was conscious of this, all these ideas around freedom, what's legal freedom, but what's actually practical freedom in your life. You can only be free if you're educated, as we know from Socrates, but also you can't be free if you're subjected to addictions, habits, unhealthy relationships. That's not freedom. Freedom is what you have and that only you can establish. For this reason, of all those matters which I have deemed essential for you, I've made nothing easier for you than to die. I've set man's life as it were on a mountainside. It soon slips down. So if you've been on a steep slope, you can understand that image in its entirety. Do but watch, and you will see how short and how ready a path leads to freedom. I've not imposed such long delays upon those who quit the world as upon those who enter it. Were it not so, fortune would hold a wide dominion over you if a man died as slowly as he is born. So that's such an amazing image, isn't it? So we know that labor can take like 10, 12, 15, 20 hours. That's how long it can take to be born. But luckily, perhaps, death doesn't take that long.
And there's even a more, broader cosmic perspective. You've waited the whole history of the cosmos to be born. And death can be chosen at any moment. You can just flee just like that in a second. So I don't know if he meant it like that, but when I think about it, I think that's quite amazing.
I'm sure he did mean it like that. Absolutely. Let all time, let every place teach you how simple it is to renounce nature and to fling back her gifts to her. Now, that's a really curious construction, because, of course, for the Stoics, the ideal was to live according to nature. So to fling back nature's gifts at her is to commit suicide, I guess. Before the altar itself and during the solemn rites of sacrifice, while life is being prayed for, learn how to die. Fat oxen fall dead with a tiny wound. A blow from a man's hand fells animals of great strength. The sutures of the neck are severed by a thin blade. And when the joint which connects the head and neck is cut, all that great mass falls. The breath of life is not deep-seated, nor only to be let forth by steel. The vitals need not be searched throughout by plunging a sword among them to the hilt. Death lies near the surface. I've not appointed any particular spot for these blows. The body may be pierced wherever you please. That very act which is called dying, by which the breath of life leaves the body, is too short for you to be able to estimate its quickness. Whether a knot crushes the windpipe or water stops your breathing, whether you fall headlong from a height and perish upon the hard ground below, or a mouthful of fire checks the drawing of your breath, whatever it is, it acts swiftly. Do you not blush to spend so long a time in dreading what it takes so short a time to do? Wow,
cheery.
you know,
Cheery.
well, but it's kind of like, well, we find it that a bit awkward because we don't think in those terms, right?
No,
But
that's
for Seneca and for the intellectuals of the first century AD, yeah, they did think about it, and they did think of it in exactly those terms. And ultimately, of course, Seneca, you know, he took his own life. He opened his veins, as they put it. So, you know, it is confronting, and I think it's meant to be this idea that Providence has allocated that option for us.
Option. That's
Well,
true.
and even regardless of the option, it's inevitable. And if we're thinking about this in terms of him doing therapy, then he's really saying at the end, this is something that we have to confront in detail. We have to think about it. We have to, because it's quite vivid. So we have to maybe in our imagination even work through the kind of what it will be like to face our death, so that so it won't be a shock for us. So we'll be prepared for it. So we will have worked out our attitude towards it, because most people, as we know, spend a lot of their time trying not to think about death.
And if you go down there, what is it, the Becker Road with the denial of death, identifying that, what does he say? The underlying cause for all neurosis is this suppressed awareness of our imminent death. I mean, that was his whole thesis, wasn't it? Ernest Becker, when he wrote that book, The Denial of Death, it was just really about that repressed, unacknowledged idea of death being so imminent and violently imminent, sort of it's freaked everyone out since they were born.
Well, all the existential type therapists deal with death in one way or another in a similar way. So, you know, Seneca is saying something that was live then, just like you're saying, Judith, it was a very obvious and important issue.
Yeah, that's true.
And sometimes these things come up in modern times. But again, like that whole thing we're saying about luxury and you know, consumerism, whatever, we try to package everything so it doesn't appear like it was that life and death is ever an issue. Like you go down to the shop and you buy your chicken all wrapped up so it looks like something completely different from what it actually is, like a dead animal. And, you know, I remember, you know, since you bring up a psychotherapist, there was a psychotherapist called Irvin Yalom, and he wrote a book called Love's Executioner. And he said, he's talking about the anxiety that people experience and the grief, the mini moments of grief they experience throughout their life when things end. Like, you know, you lose a job, or you lose your partner breaks up with you, or maybe something as trivial as your favorite series of TV shows is cancelled. And what he says is that the great thing that happens for the person who finally dies is that they die for the last time. And that's the kind of thing that Seneca is really getting at, is that rather than spend a life where you're constantly running away from your inability to face death, if you give it the attention that it's required and really mindfully live with that, hopefully you can accept it as a natural fact, and then you won't live with any sort of anxiety, because what else is there? You can't, there's no point wasting your time trying to get status and honors and money, because all those things will be taken away at the end. You need to have a very realistic reappraisal of what it means to be a human being who dies.
And being alive. Yes, absolutely. And that prevents you from being destroyed or anything major. Like somebody, Peterson, I think, did a great story on, like, when a really strong marriage explodes, it's not it's not that the loss of the marriage, it's that everything else that's fixed and you have security within in your life, it all gets shaken. It's like one of those things where everything starts shaking, you know, like it's not the particular thing you lost, but if it's a big thing that you had a lot of security invested in, a lot of belief and faith in, everything else you had faith in is suddenly rocked and moved. And that's why some of those events are so profoundly destructive or, you know, disturbing. And I
Well,
guess the bottom of that would be that acknowledgement of our impermanence. If the death thing is approached, well, then everything dies. And in an analogous way, everything you have, you create, you have a relationship with is going to die.
yeah, of
Just like
course. I think in Nussbaum's book, she makes that exact comparison with Nikidian, and she talks about how our propositions, our beliefs all hang together in a kind of network. And when one changes, they all change. But the point, of course, is this is more preventative. So rather than being in a situation where you've got this life that's deeply enmeshed with the belief of trying to avoid death, instead, you don't have that thing going on in the first place. So when things change or disappear or being taken away from you, you don't have any kind of particular overpowering evaluation for them, and nothing much changes for you.
And it's subconscious. If you haven't seen it and looked at it, it's all happening unconsciously or subconsciously, whatever, below the fucking level of any awareness. That's why it's so incredibly disturbing, because you don't know what's going on. You don't see
Well,
all those links. You think it's all just about you getting divorced and it's about the, you know, your ex or whatever. And no, it's not even about that. It's about all the stuff. It's much bigger than that. You know.
Well, exactly, and that's where the Stoics have got an absolute bead on what's going on, because ultimately everything is changeable, everything is malleable, everything is fallible, everything changes. You know, that there are no certainties ultimately, and that's why we have to accept that we live in a changeable world, and that the cycles of the cosmos are going on. As Seneca says, you know, even he himself, between when he started the letter to Lycidius and when he's halfway through it, he's changed. You know, everything is changing all the time.
So flexibility would be a core skill. Flexibility.
Well, yeah, or just recognition that everything is changing, everything is dissolving, everything is moving to moving within the cycles that characterize the cosmos. That's, you know, and if we recognize that, we're better placed to accept them and to adjust our expectations of what's likely to happen next.
But how do we invest in structure and discipline to further our lives, coinciding with that awareness? How do we develop that awareness and then still invest with some intensity or commitment to fixed? You know, we're all world traveling things. We're trying to do stuff to make good change happen. It's all structural, and then we've got to also at the same time acknowledge it sort of takes a bit of the fire out. I don't know, maybe, I don't know, maybe you have to deny and shut all that shit down to actually do things really stridently and achieve great heights. How can you do those two things together? Like, are they diametrically opposed in a way that they would just fight each other all the time?
Well, that's one of the seeming contradictions that's absolutely core to Stoicism, is the need for the wise person to be constant, to have predictable reactions and responses to what's going on, but at the same time recognizing that everything is in flux. That's what we are. That's what the cosmos is. The cosmos is in flux. There are cycles going on. There are changes, and we ourselves are essentially in dissolution, even as we carry on our daily life. So it's recognizing those seeming contradictions that is at the core of Stoicism, because that's ultimately realistic. That's what's happening.
Yeah, that's
true.
You know,
but there are
certain things like ethics may be out of the bounds of that. So certain things like ethics are untouchable by that. flexibility or that changeableness. Would you say that they're promoting that idea that certain core values or ethics aren't going to be, they're not vulnerable to the ravages of these
Well,
changes and things?
They have to be fundamental principles which are based on physics, for example. So, you know, like Judith's talking about, I get to show off my crappy Greek and say that Marcus Aurelius said, "Ho cosmos alaiosis, ho bios hypolepsis," right? And that's the same thing. It's the cosmos is always changing, it's always flowing, it's always changing. But for us, for life, it's all judgment. And it's about getting that judgment in alignment with nature, obviously, the cosmos. But we're right at the end of our stuff now. So before you jump in, Johnny, and start a new thing, why don't we give a little summary of who we thought won, since it's like a versus thing? Did Schopenhauer win? Or did Seneca win?
That's easy.
Well, I think Schopenhauer came out ahead. No, I'm kidding. No, Seneca.
No, I don't think you think that. No.
I think that
It was brutal last week. Brutal.
I think Seneca's argument was incredibly nuanced and clever and deeply psychological. I just think it is a wonderful and clever. Like, he could have just done something straight from the Stoic rule book, but no, he's just a wonderful rhetorician and a beautiful writer. And yeah, Schopenhauer's just a big dick bag. But yeah, what did you guys reckon?
Poor old fella. I mean, what he said, you know what old mate said about the personality? So, you know how did I say that before, in Good and Evil? No, Nietzsche nailed that right at the beginning, saying these philosophical theories are all just emanations of, what do you say? Emanations of individual philosophies are emanations of personalities involved, masquerading as explications of universal philosophical revelations of truth. So Nietzsche was really onto that idea that they were much more. So Schopenhauer's thing is just, that's him. That he's sort of promoting some sort of a philosophical theory that's really just about him and his life. I do remember Nietzsche saying.
Well, Seneca won't agree with that, I'm sure. But what do you think, Judith?
He wouldn't.
Yeah, I think Seneca gives the best account that we've basically got of a theodicy. You know, I mean, and all the theodicies ever since have relied heavily on Seneca's account. If we're going to accept a providential cosmos and the fact that suffering happens to good people, then we're not likely to have a better we're not likely to have a better account of it than Seneca gives here.
Yeah, and we could get themes from, remember when we read Boethius, I remember some sections in Boethius in his poems, and that reminded me very much of this argument in On Providence. So yeah, and I love Boethius, so I just think it was really, I don't know, it was almost nostalgic. We've only been doing this for a couple of years, but it was wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Boethius would have had Seneca in mind, and he would have had Plato's Gorgias in mind. You know, he was in his prison cell before he was tortured to death. He had all these forebears going on. Yeah, it's wonderful.
And in complete agreement with Seneca's view that how lucky are we to be where we're at? How lucky are we that we now have this wonderful friendship, but we can also access these wonderful works that Boethius himself used as a consolation for his great suffering and adversity, and we have access to it today now, and we can talk about these wonderful things and wonder about, luckily for us, or unluckily as Seneca would say, we can work out these things before we're actually in the lion's mouth, so to speak. You know what I mean?
That's right. Going to a horrible death.
Yes, but I'm kind of happy to tie things up there. Unless you've got something further to say.
No. I was just going to say, so the core thing of the Providence is that he's saying even the bad stuff, it strengthens men and creates character. That's sort of why he was saying it's all providential, wasn't it? Because there's good stuff happens and bad stuff happens, but the bad stuff creates a better person anyway.
So if it's bad and it makes you better, how can it be bad?
Yeah, so it's providential. Yes.
Well,
Is-
a good thing can't make a bad thing, so it can't possibly be bad.
Well, he's saying there's nothing bad can be made from anything that comes from nature, sort of, isn't it? Doesn't Marcus Aurelius say it a few times too? Nothing bad can actually come from what you're given.
Yeah,
Nothing.
100%. Yeah, there's nothing actually bad in nature, which is kind of
Yeah.
obviously a bit counterintuitive, but
Controversial.
that's the Stoic worldview, that there's nothing really bad, and it was a Socratic worldview as well. And I think we are called upon here to recall Socrates in the Phaedo and the Apology, when basically, he turns around and says, "Oh, this jailer that I've got to know in the last few weeks, what a wonderful guy he is." It's like, yeah, that's what we're called to do here, is to find the good in what seems to be not so good.
Well,
Which
thanks
isn't a
very
bad-
much, guys. That was
guys.
awesome. So let's
Yeah,
wrap it
it's
up, and yeah,
Thanks.
I'll
Appreciate
see you
it.
all soon. Bye bye.
Thanks. Yeah, I learned heaps.
See ya.
See ya.